Hello, folks. How are you? This is Chris here, and welcome to Elevate Season 7, our discussion on Catholicism versus Orthodoxy. This is the first part of our last double header of Elevate Season 7. And this is a pre-record of that talk that will be given, I believe, on March 15th. This is the first one up that morning. So for those of you that are unaware of what Elevate is, a talk series we do at Holy Family Catholic Church in Orange. The topics are suggested by the people that come to the talk series and then are voted on by those very same people. And each year I guess half year, we present a new series based on the topics to get the top votes. And this was one of those topics. So that's why we're talking about it. And today, again, just a pre-record for those people that can't make it on Saturday, but still want to, get the information. So as with all things, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, thank you so much for all that you've given us. Thank you for uh, giving us our great faith, the Catholic faith. And we just ask that as we walk through what happened and why it happened that caused the split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox, that you open our hearts and minds and let us understand that there's always more at work than at first we might think. And we also pray that someday you can make it possible to help us overcome the challenges that we certainly have created ourselves that prevent us from coming back together. And we ask this in your holy name, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, just as a word of introduction, most people are aware that the Catholic Church is a series of 24 churches. Most people, at least, are vaguely aware of that, and that, one of those churches is the Latin Rite Church, the Roman Church, and that is the single largest group of Catholics. But there are 23 other Catholic churches that are in full communion with the Pope. And those are mainly churches from the ancient eastern parts of the world. You're also aware that there's this thing called the Eastern Orthodox, which are not in full communion with the Pope, and it's a series of churches or religious groups that are loosely confederated, actually much more loosely confederated today than ever. In some cases, in actual open lack of communion now, not confederated at all, but that most people believe split off from the Catholic Church in the year 1054. Well, I want to start by telling you that is an interesting story, the 1054 split. And there was a major event in 1054, but the split between Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox churches, what is basically the Catholic churches of the West versus the Catholic churches of the East, was a long brewing issue. This wasn't something that happened because of any single event or doctrinal problem. This is something that was brewing for centuries, and in many cases, you could almost say it was destined to occur at some point. Which means that, it was man-made. It was a man-made problem, which means it can be fixed as well. And so we're going to talk. We're going to talk about what led to that split. What are the actual doctrinal issues that are out there, both significant ones and what are in reality just totally insignificant doctrinal or practice issues. And then what would it take for, these two great organizations, which together I believe represent about 1.4 billion people on the planet, to recombine, to more clearly unify the church that was created by Jesus Christ. And Pope St. John Paul II said it great. You see the quote here on this opening slide. The church must breathe with her two lungs. And that's really what we have to think about here. We have to think about the fact and the reality of the situation that the Eastern Orthodox are the ancient Eastern Christian churches. Matter of fact, you could say they are the most ancient of all of the churches. And for us to be separated from our Eastern brothers is as if we had taken our two lungs and and separated them and have them working independently. And that obviously is not very efficient for the human body, and it certainly isn't efficient for the faith that Christ established. So let's walk through it. And as in all things, it's probably best to start in the beginning. Okay. So in the beginning, it was clear there was one church founded by Jesus. He spent his 3 years of missionary camping with his apostles and other disciples, really establishing the foundation of that church, preparing these men and women, primarily the apostles, the men, to lead the church, but to understand what it was that he was trying to establish, his kingdom on earth, to prepare them to spread and defend the faith, to prepare them to govern the church, and to, by setting examples, showing him how to deal with pastoral issues and issues of doctrine and what have you. And that's really what his mission was about, as much as anything. And sometimes we miss that fact. Okay. He was here to incorporate humanity into the establishment of his kingdom and give humanity a role in making that kingdom a reality over time. And again, it was one church. He prayed for it to be one. He knew it would not stay as one. Okay, but that doesn't stop him from praying and hoping against hope that man would receive the grace of God and act accordingly. But again, in the beginning, one church, a church that started in the Mideast, in Jerusalem, and spread outward from there over time. And that church did indeed spread. It grew and spread pretty quickly, okay, which just is a testament to the reality of Jesus's resurrection and the passion that created in people. So, this map gives you a sense of, what Christianity looked like up until about AD 600. The darker purple, that's where Christianity really was well established by the year 325, an important marker because that's the year of the first church council, first official church council, the Council of Nicaea. And then the lighter purple is, where that spread had continued up until the year about 600. So you can see that, in what is relatively a short period of time, a good chunk of the modern world had not only been exposed to Christianity, but converted to Christianity. And, over that time, matter of fact, very early on even, there were major centers of theology and church administration. So, when you're talking about theology, you're always going to hear about the Antiochian school or the Alexandrian school. So Antioch and Alexandria, you can see them in the lower right of this map. So Northern Africa, Alexandria, north of Syria, Antioch. Those were two centers of theological study and theological thought that both played a very important role in all the Christological debates that occurred in the first, really 9-10 centuries of the church. And then in between those two, you see Jerusalem, the birthplace of the church, also a major hub. You also, above them, you see Constantinople, the old Byzantium, was made the capital of the Roman Empire by Constantine, hence the name Constantinople. If you're a king, you can name the capital after yourself, apparently. And then you see Rome off to the left, the old capital of the Roman Empire. So, Rome had been the center of the Roman Empire, or at least the capital of the Roman Empire, for centuries, until Constantine recognized that it might be safer for him and his family to be separated from the Roman Senate by some distance, and hence moved the capital of Constantinople, leaving the Roman Senate behind in Rome. But these were the 5 centers: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, as you move around the clock. We call these the Pentarchy, okay? And so major places of influence. Certainly Rome, the home to the Pope, okay? Our first Pope, Peter, certainly, made it thus. That was his last bishopric, where he was the bishop of Rome. He at one point was also the bishop of Antioch, just so you should be aware of that. But he ended his life as the Bishop of Rome, and we've recognized Rome as the center of theological purity ever since then. And the Pope, the successors of Peter in that bishopric, as having the power that Jesus bestowed on him, the keys to the kingdom and the power to bind and loose. But, when you have something that grows this fast and grows over that wide geography and that many different cultures and that many different, um, you know, uh, historical events, there's going to be impediments to keeping it all together as one. Okay. And probably the single biggest impediment, if you go back to that map, is you had the Latin speaking West. So, think of splitting that map in half, putting a vertical line directly in the center of that map. And pretty much everything on the left-hand side of that line would be Latin speaking, okay, at least the civilized elements of it. And pretty much everything on the right-hand side of that line would still be primarily Greek speaking. So Greek was the official language of the Roman Empire. And as the empire started to crumble, Latin, the vulgar language, the language of the common people, emerged in the West, while Greek was retained in the East. And right there, you have a pretty significant problem, is these languages do not have direct mappings and translations. And, and you find this with almost every language. There's words in one language that can't be adequately expressed in another, and idioms that are unique to language and culture and things of that nature. So right off the bat, you have a little bit of a problem with communication between the church in the East and the church in the West. And then you have, the demise of the Roman Empire. So when Rome fell to the Goths in the 5th century, all of a sudden the Roman Empire, which, it always had its East and its West, was now pretty much just an East. With some sort of bizarre, vague claims on the West, but no ability to have that authority implemented or listened to, and limited ability to muster any forces to help the cause in the West. So what ended up happening is you have Constantinople in the East, the core of the Roman Empire, and the West was sort of then left to fare for itself. And that led to a rise in a great deal of authority in the person of the Pope. Remember, there are no nation states here. That's not what existed. We had the Roman Empire that was put together over a series of many centuries, feeding off of the old Greek Empire. And now all of a sudden that authority structure is gone. So people turn to the only authority structure that was left, which was the church, and hence the authority figure, the Pope. So you all of a sudden had a Pope that was not only a religious leader, but had become a temporal leader in many ways as well. And this causes a problem, because the church in the East is very much aligned with the Byzantine emperor. So the Byzantine Empire is what the Roman Empire in the East turned into or became. And you have the church in the East very much aligned with the Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine emperor. And you have the church in the West, which is still clearly aligned with just the Pope. There is no other temporal authority. So that created some problems. And then we had a whole series of very important Christological issues that we had to handle, a number of heresies that arose. And very often there was a split, an East-West split, where, these heresies primarily were raised by great thinkers out of either the Alexandrian or Antiochian schools. And that's where heresies come from. Heresies, just don't drop out of the sky from nowhere. There's some people that are putting in some pretty, serious theological thought. Unfortunately, that thought goes astray, and hence you have a heresy like Arianism, which promoted that Christ was a created being. There was a time when he was not, which means he is not eternal and he is not fully God. There's God the Father and then God the Son, but God the Son is a created being, which makes him lesser than the Father. So huge problem there for many reasons. But again, we often saw this split along the East and the West, and I'm convinced it is because you had those great theological schools in the East with all this great thinking and debate. Whenever you have great thinking and debate, you have crazy ideas that are brought up, and and sometimes they catch on. So whether it be Arianism or Macedonianism or Nestorianism, monophysitism or monothelitism. Um, Again, these are pretty significant, especially monophysitism. We're going to talk quite a bit about that. Uh, these are pretty significant theological heresies that required, as you can see, if you look at the notes here, a church council to bring them to resolution, and normally more than one council. So one thing you learn about heresies is they rarely die with the first blow. Usually takes quite some time for a heresy to be, thoroughly squashed, and almost never is a heresy completely wiped out. So again, some of these heresies that you see on the screen continue to exist to this very day, despite the fact that they were ultimately resolved in most cases well over 1,000 years ago. But you had these heresies that created some splits, and we're going to get more into the detail of that along those east-west lines. Then again, as I mentioned before, you had the Byzantine emperor's influence over the Eastern Church. So, you didn't have that temporal authority in the West that was able to dispute things with the Pope. There wasn't a central temporal authority, but in the East you did have that. And the emperors often took on, and by the way, in the West, later emperors will take on a similar approach, but emperors often took on the role of protectorate of the faith, okay, or protector of the faith, and like to dabble in faith decision making. So that created a problem with the East. And then finally, probably the biggest single impacts, well, specifically on the Eastern Church, was the rise of Islam in the 7th century. And so from the time in the first third of the 7th century when Muhammad first developed Islam to just 1 century later, almost all of the Christian world in the East had been taken over by Muslims. Okay, doesn't mean all the Christians were wiped out, essentially, although a great many converted or were forced to convert, or giving an offer they could not refuse if they wanted to continue to have employment and gainful living. But again, you saw Eastern Christianity fall very rapidly. So, the birthplace of Christianity became the home of Islam. And it wasn't just the Middle East, it was the Near East, extending into India in the later centuries, all of northern Africa, which again was a hotbed of Christianity, had become Islamic. And really, we're talking about Western Europe as well, Portugal, Spain, and at one point, almost half of what would be modern day France had become Islamic. So a pretty big change, but it primarily affected the East. It was stopped in the West and actually pushed back in the West over time. Although Spain, it did take almost 7 centuries, I believe. I think the single longest contiguous war in the history of modern civilization, or the history of civilization that we have recorded. But anyway, huge impact on Eastern Christianity. So, the question becomes, did this split actually happen in 1054, or was 1054 more of a final straw? And I'm going to argue it was clearly more of a final straw. And as you're going to find out, it wasn't even that final, because there were reunifications following 1054. It really wasn't until the 15th century that the final blow was struck with the fall of Constantinople to Islam. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm going to put forth the theory that no, this was not the date of the split. This was just a convenient date for historians to point to, because there was a documented event that happened in that period of time that again officially created a split. But I think the split was building and in place long before that. So let's go back and review some history. And by the way, the image that you're seeing on the screen here is a rendering of what Constantinople would have looked like in the first millennium. As you can see, quite an extensive city, and for all accounts of purposes, a beautiful city with extreme wealth, well positioned between Europe and Asia, so on major trading routes. Just a marvel. It's something you wish you could see today, and you could. You can see elements of it today by visiting what it is today, which is Istanbul. Okay. And again, Istanbul, modern Istanbul, is also quite an amazing city. If you ever a chance to get there, it is worth a visit. And there are elements of ancient Constantinople that you can still view while in Istanbul, including the Hagia Sophia, which is currently a mosque, but at one point was the largest Catholic church on the planet. So let's go back in history. I'm going to take a sip of coffee before history because I want to be revved up for you on this one. So I'm going to go pretty far back. I'm going to go back to the late second century and point to an event um, that is instrumental or important on a number of fronts. So first off, late second century, Pope Victor. He was the Pope between 189 and 199, so a decade. And he was the one who was left to resolve what was starting to become the first disruptive church-wide crisis since the Judaizer crisis, which we read about in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. And that is resolving what the date of Easter should be, or at least what day it should be celebrated. And you really had two major trains of thought here. You had it should be celebrated on a Sunday, okay, because that is the day that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead. Or you should celebrate it on the actual calendar period that resolves with the celebration of Passover, which means it could fall on any day of the week. Easter could not just be a Sunday, it could be a Monday through Saturday as well. But related to the date on the Jewish calendar, the 14th of Nisan, and people that promoted that were called quadridecimans. And what ended up happening is it really became more of an East-West issue. In the East, they favored the 14th of Nisan, so that Easter would be moving, at least the day of the week it falls on would be moving um, every year. While those in the West had traditionally celebrated it on that Sunday, and wanted to retain it as Sunday. And Pope Victor finally came down with a pretty harsh ruling. Prior popes had allowed both practices to coexist, but Pope Victor had enough because it was really becoming a polarizing issue, and he just declared it's going to be this Sunday, and this is how we're going to calculate it. So, and on top of that, he said, and by the way, if you don't follow that, you're excommunicated. So he really put the power of the papacy behind this. And as a matter of fact, Saint Irenaeus, who was an Eastern Church father, he came out of the East, despite the fact that he was then named the Bishop of Lyon, which would be in the West. He is from the East and is recognized as a church father for both East and West as a result. But Irenaeus actually warned the Pope, said, "Hey, this is something you should not do. This is not going to go over well. Both the enforcement of the dates. Why not take the policy previous popes had taken and just let this go? It's not that important." But Pope Victor was very focused on unity and very focused on demonstrating his authority. And Irenaeus didn't actually say, "Well, you don't have the authority to do this." He actually recognized that the Pope does indeed have the authority to do this. He just counseled him that there'd be better ways to do it, and that to apply an excommunication as a penalty is quite extreme. But Irenaeus never came out and said, "And you can't do that." He recognized that he could. So it is a recognition of the primacy of the papacy from a very early period. But it also was like a thorn, taking a thorn and banging it into the side of the Eastern fathers' heads, and probably an unnecessary thorn. We move forward another century, and this is a huge issue. And again, Constantine, I mentioned it before, he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. And his rationale for doing this was multiple fold, but one piece that often gets lost to history was, if you're the Roman emperor, it was pretty dangerous for you to be near the Senate because it always seemed that the Roman Empire or emperor was overthrown and murdered, assassinated by the Senate. There's been some pretty famous Shakespearean plays about that, but he recognized it might be safer for him and his family if he migrated the capital several thousand miles to the east, but left the Senate in Rome. And that's exactly what he did. But in doing so, all of a sudden now you created a natural tension between the new Eastern capital and the old Western capital of the Roman Empire. And that's going to play a profound effect in history. Then we have, right at that same time, the rise of the first major Christological heresy, Arianism. And that resulted in a back and forth that lasted well beyond the councils. As a matter of fact, it took two councils to effectively put the dagger or the stake in this one's heart. It took the Council of Nicaea and then 60 years later, the Council of Constantinople. Ooh, better drink some more coffee. Excuse me. But again, this is a heresy that grew out of the East, actually out of Alexandria, and a priest called Arius, and really retained life with the support of some prominent bishops in the East. So this became an East-West issue as much as a Christological heresy. And strangely enough, it was ultimately defeated by some very strong Eastern fathers, the Cappadocian fathers, as a matter of fact. So Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, and Saint Basil at Constantinople. They're the ones that ultimately did put the stake in the heart of this creature. But again, creates a lot of tensions there, a lot of orders to do X, where the Pope is supporting the defeat of Arianism, and at times the emperor in the East is actually promoting Arianism. So again, you're starting to see more and more of this back and forth, and that didn't change much over time. Again, you had the Council of Constantinople, which required which was called to not just put a final end to Arianism, but also several other Christological heresies that had raised their ugly head over time. But there's an interesting thing that happened at this council a lot of people aren't aware of. So when the council documents were produced and sent back to the Pope, so very, very rarely would the Pope go to these councils. He would send legates, representatives. But travel was tough. Okay, so traveling from Rome to Constantinople was not something most would do by choice. So, in a lot of these early councils, what you saw is they were heavily populated by the bishops of the region in which the council was held. But one thing they all recognized was, hey, ultimately the Pope has to approve this. So again, another early indication that there is papal primacy. But one thing that came out of this council was a canon was put in there, which actually said that Constantinople was now on par, okay, or on equal footing with Rome from a religious leadership, moral authority perspective. And this was rejected by the Pope. And it's something a lot of people don't know, but the Pope does indeed have line item veto. It's think of it as a bill passing through Congress, and the president is going to approve the bill that was voted on, but he may apply a line item veto to an element of that bill to kill that element. That's exactly what happened here. The Pope actually rejected this. And made the point, hey, the primacy of Rome has nothing to do with the fact that it was once the capital, because the argument for making Constantinople equal was that it's the new capital, and the Pope made the argument back saying that is not why Rome is prime. Rome is prime because it was built on Peter. He actually references Matthew 16, tu es Petros, you are Peter, and upon this rock I build my church. And then to make it a little bit more painful, the Pope, when he addresses his letter back, his line item veto back, he addresses a letter to the Eastern bishops, and he does something that was unnecessary, that stoked some of the troubles. He referred to them as sons, not brothers. So really kind of rubbing it in. Yeah, not only is Rome prime, but you are clearly secondary, and probably not the best thing to do, not the best pastoral approach there. But it was clear that Rome's primacy would not be challenged. Then we move forward another few decades, and this is when the Western Empire does indeed collapse when Rome is sacked by the Goths in 410, and that papal authority does become a secular or temporal authority in the West. Not that the emperor in the East ever said, "Oh no, we're not in power over there anymore." The emperor still claimed power in the West; he just couldn't exercise it. He didn't actually have the power, the armies, and the ability to enforce his will in the West. So the West was really kind of out on its own, blowing in the wind, and the only institution that people could look to for leadership was indeed the church, led by the Pope. And then we have the first split. Okay. Now, Orthodox will tell you, and rightly so, technically, that this is not an Eastern Orthodox split. This is the Assyrian Church in the East. So it's the first split of an Eastern church. And what happened is we had the Council of Ephesus in 431, where we're dealing with the Nestorian heresy. And after the council, destroyed the Nestorian heresy, or, declared it for what it was, the Assyrian Church in the East just simply could not accept that. They were, I wouldn't say they were Nestorian, through and through, but certainly they had Nestorian leanings. And they decided at that point that they could no longer stay in communion with the balance of the church. So they split from both the East and the West in 431, which sets an interesting precedent. Because now you have a group, a very large group. So the Assyrian Church of the East, which also included what are today the modern day Chaldeans, which, by the way, have since returned to the Catholic Church. The Assyrian Church in the East was a pretty significant player in those days. So this set a precedent that breaking away from communion from the church was not only possible, but could be done, based on the whims of the men in that church, and that's what happened here. Then we move down the path a little bit farther. We get through Ephesus, and that brings us right back to another Christological problem around the natures of Christ and the heresy of monophysitism. So we have the Council of Chalcedon that is called to deal with this. And again, another instance where papal primacy and authority are on full display. The Pope again sent his legates to the council, but he also sent them with the letter known as the Tome of Leo, a pretty lengthy document that was read into the council proceedings. And again, Peter was making Leo was making a number of theological arguments against monophysitism in there, about the dual natures of Christ. So Christ has to be fully divine and fully human for the work of his sacrifice to have any salvific effect. And as a result, he made really just a great theological argument that when it was heard, the response was, wow, Peter has spoken through Leo. So, these are bishops primarily of the East, but with many from the West as well, all recognizing that the authority of Peter is continuing to speak through the Pope. And that heresy of monophysitism, which was very popular in the East, okay? Again, getting back to language and theology, popular, I think, only because of the language that was used around it, really made it attractive and understandable. But it was defeated. But the result of that was another split. So now you have what are called the Oriental Orthodox churches, not to be confused with the current modern day Eastern Orthodox churches. So again, the Orthodox will say, well, that's not us, that's a different group. Well, different, but not really. Okay, from the same family tree here. The number of Oriental Orthodox churches exited communion with the Catholic Church at this point. So this would be the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Eritreans, the Armenians, and the Syriac and the Malankara out of India, all exit communion with the church over this because they would not give up on their monophysitistic beliefs. Okay, so again, we now have the Assyrian Church in the east out there. We have this group of 6 churches that is now split off. Again, laying more groundwork for a greater split. And then we have a little bit of a split with Constantinople itself. So in the 5 patriarchies, okay, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, you had patriarchs, or what were often called patriarchs. We called the Roman patriarch the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. But these other guys took on that name patriarch, and there was a name that was really stuck with the leader of the Constantinopolitan Church. And the patriarch there, Acacius, and the emperor, the Byzantine emperor at the time, actually decided no, they can't stay in communion with the church anymore, because they themselves continue to support monophysitism. So that's the Acacian Schism, and that lasted for over 35 years into the 6th century. So here you do actually have what is a modern day Eastern Orthodox Church splitting away, at least for a period of time, from the Catholic Church. Then in the early 6th century, in an attempt to fix that problem, the new emperor, who was no longer who wasn't a monophysitist, went to the Pope and said, "Hey, I think we can fix this problem. I need something from you, and I need a document from you that would give us the theological oomph from the Pope that would address this once and for all." And so Pope Hormisdas actually produced that. And it's called the Formula of Hormisdas. And what the emperor did was he forced all the Eastern bishops to sign it. So this document not only went through the theological concepts behind true, Catholic teaching about the nature and wills of Jesus Christ, but it also actually had sections in there about the primacy of Rome. So popes were very clear; they were going to continue reiterating that. Matter of fact, the section on the primacy of Rome was so powerful in this Formula of Hormisdas from the 6th century that Vatican I in the 19th century actually references it in its declaration. So the First Vatican Council used this exact same formula in many ways to actually support the doctrinal statements it was making about papal primacy and infallibility. But the point here was the emperor, who had a good intention, he wanted unity in the empire, and hence unity in the church would be essential to that, wanted to end this Acacian schism. But his way of doing it, even though it was doctrinally correct, was politically poor, because he did indeed force all the Eastern bishops to sign it. So you can be forced to sign anything. That doesn't mean that your mind has changed and you now believe what you signed. So a little bit of another thorn thrown in there. And then we move forward, new emperor, okay. New emperor says, okay, that didn't work. Okay. We still have this problem with the monophysites, or the old monophysites, who are still upset about what came out of Chalcedon. And we're talking now, we're getting on to be a couple centuries later here, or at least a century later. Justinian, Emperor Justinian I, comes up with an idea he thinks will satisfy them. He's going to have 3 of the bishops who were at Chalcedon, who, by the way, are now dead, condemned for their teaching. And by having these 3 Eastern bishops who actually supported Chalcedon condemned, it in some way was supposed to appease the remaining Eastern bishops, which still had monophysitite leanings. Okay. Now, originally, the Pope at the time, Vigilus, he refused to sign on to this idea, did not think it was the best, until he was arrested and dragged to Constantinople. Something that emperors will tend to do through history is, when they're not happy with the Pope not agreeing with them, they simply go take the Pope. And strangely enough, as it happened in this case, the popes generally then start to see the light of the emperor's thinking. And that's what happened here. And Vigilus supported this idea of condemning the three chapters while he was in Constantinople, which made him very unpopular in the West. And he remained unpopular in the East because these guys weren't stupid and didn't think this was a great idea either. So you had a problem now, both the East and the West is against the Pope. And then as soon as the Pope is released from Constantinople, he immediately, at least publicly, removes his support for the condemnation of these three gentlemen. Um, but at the same time, he turns out he's secretly writing to the emperor saying, look, publicly I'm saying I'm not for it, but I actually do think this isn't a bad idea. And why don't we just let some time pass and the hubbub die down a bit, and then I can come out and fully support it. Well, Justinian, he actually used this to prove a point that many of us still have to learn today. Be careful what you put in writing. Justinian ends up calling another church council. And by the way, often a church council would be called by the emperor, even though it wasn't an official ecumenical council unless it was or it gained the approval of the Pope. So a lot of people could call councils, only the Pope could actually give it any weight. But Justinian called the Council of Constantinople II, this in 553, had the three chapters formally condemned. So this actually happened at a ecumenical council. And then he also released the secret letters of the Pope to support that condemnation, showing him that, look, even the Pope says this is a good idea, which obviously destroyed the Pope, okay? As a matter of fact, the Pope ended up getting condemned at that council for his actions. And as he returned, this is one of those rare councils where the Pope went. Maybe this is why popes didn't go to councils, but he went to this one. And in returning from Constantinople, he actually died in transit. And this had a major impact on undermining papal prestige. Here you have a pope that's caught in a public lie. He's saying one thing to the world and writing letters to the emperor that say something different. Clearly, also at the same time, if he truly does support the condemnation of the three chapters, he's supporting something that really makes no theological sense. So this did not do much for the papacy. If anything, it was a major black eye, damaging East-West relationships as well as emperor-pope relationships as well as pope to the rest of the church relationships. So a major contributor to the ability of the split to eventually occur. And then, this is still going on. Okay, so we're still talking about this almost 300 years later. I should probably have it more than 200 years later. So it's almost 300, not more than 300. Pope Honorius I, he also does something stupid. And he says, well, maybe we can fix it by, taking a compromise solution. The compromise solution itself called monothelitism, which means, okay, yeah, he has two natures, but only one will. So we didn't like the one nature idea. How about we try to say, okay, we'll all agree on two natures, but we're going to give him only one will, a divine will. This is monothelitism. So you had monophysitism, one nature. Now you have monothelitism, one will. This was supposed to be a compromise theology. It was proposed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, but Honorius seems to have supported the idea, or at least he doesn't condemn it outright in a letter he wrote. Now, it's not clear that he was a big supporter of the idea as much as he wasn't a condemner. And again, this is where language comes into play. It's not clear, if in the translation from Latin to Greek and back was part of the message being lost or misrepresented. So there's quite a bit of discussion now about what Honorius actually was trying to convey here, okay? But the bottom line was this actually upset the West quite a bit, because here it is, something that was decided in ecumenical council, a couple centuries earlier. We now have a pope that seemingly is okay with yet another heresy. Honorius, he passes on. The next four popes, none of whom were awesome, but at least were smart enough to recognize Orthodox theology. they rejected the whole concept of monothelitism, but now it's out there, which means we have to have a council. Okay. So Pope Agatho calls a council. Now we're at Constantinople III, the Third Council of Constantinople, to finally condemn monothelitism. At that point, Pope Honorius was censured, okay, because of that letter, so he wasn't, condemned as a heretic or excommunicated or anything. By the way, he was dead, so it wouldn't have mattered much. But he was censored for that, because he wasn't making an infallible statement in support of monothelitism, but he was leading the flock astray. Okay. And by the way, this might be a good point just to remind everybody. When we talk about papal infallibility, it doesn't mean popes don't make mistakes. They make them all the time, even theological mistakes, even mistakes in the areas of faith and morals. What papal infallibility means is it's impossible for a pope to make a infallible declaration, okay, that binds the Catholic faithful. That's the important part. The Catholics then must believe and be in error. So it's a negative protection. It protects the Pope from ever saying something that binds the Catholic faithful to a teaching that turns out not to be a correct teaching. That's all infallibility means. So people kind of overstate it, and they look at the situation with Honorius or some other popes. There's, John the 22nd is another one that comes along in history that seems to make quasi-heretical statements. The key is they're not binding the Catholic faithful to believe. They're just actually offering a theological opinion, which can be an error. But anyway, we have this council called that again censors the Pope, but more importantly defeats monothelitism, or at least puts a mild stake in the heart. Then we move into the 8th century, and we have the Byzantine emperor. Now remember, we're in 726 here. So Islam has been ravaging the Middle East, Near East, Africa, and into Europe at this point, and seemingly is unstoppable. And the Byzantine emperor, who has watched his empire get slowly eaten away, where he probably only has real power over now 10 to 15% of what was once the eastern half of the Roman Empire. He starts looking for reasons why, the Islam keeps winning and the Muslim kings and warlords keep defeating the Christian armies. And he comes to the conclusion that maybe God's punishing the Christians for their use of images. Okay. It's idol worship. So he turns around and orders images to be destroyed. All images, pictures, statues, whatever it is. So this is called iconoclasm. It's a heresy. All right. It certainly causes a huge rift with the West. So the Eastern bishops kind of go along with it, because remember, they are pretty tightly aligned and under the thumb to a large extent of the Byzantine Empire. So they go along with it. But the reality is this directly flew in the face of the incarnational basis of our faith. Christ actually came and took on a human form. At that point, he was demonstrating to us that taking on a form, God taking on a form is certainly okay. He took on a human form. And we believe in that incarnational, that sensible access to God's grace. It's the basis for our whole sacramental system. So iconoclasm actually seemed to take a step backwards here, saying, sensical perception of God and his grace is just a non-starter. And that's actually a non-starter with the Catholic faith. So the iconoclasm dispute was, again, added to that East-West split. It took another pope to call another council. Now this is the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 to defeat iconoclasm. At this point, you also get the claim in that Second Council of Nicaea that once again, Hadrian, who was the Pope at the time, seems to be speaking for Peter. So it's just the papacy, which had some down years, seems to be re-elevating itself here in this situation. But you also have the rise of First it was Pepin, then his son Charlemagne, as the great secular leaders now in the West. So the West, which had been floundering without a very clear leadership base, now all of a sudden has one. So now you have a emperor in the West and an emperor in the East, and obviously that's going to lead to clashes. And by the way, it also led to some problems for the church in the West, because again, when the papacy was the only power, both spiritual and temporal in the West, it was pretty easy for the papacy to get done what it needed to get done. But now that you actually have a strong military leader that the Pope helped create, in part from a point of view of protection of the Pope, but be careful what you create, because he actually created now someone, or at least a position, that could challenge his authority. So it just complicated matters further in this East-West dichotomy that we have here. And then, we get to, the 9th century, and you have a guy named Photius, who, by the way, today, Photius is a recognized, hey, dog, stop it, a recognized church father in the East, and is venerated in the East. But Photius became the patriarch of Constantinople after the rightly placed patriarch Ignatius had an out or outed the emperor for incest. The emperor did not like that, so he had Ignatius, the rightful patriarch of Constantinople, deposed, and then he installed Photius. Obviously, not a good thing. Pope is not pleased with the emperor, putting people in positions of authority in the church. This whole idea, by the way, went on for really a millennia, where emperors did do this and kings did this, and it's a whole nother problem for a whole nother talk. But Photius really became controversial right from the beginning, not just because of how he got his position, but also because he started to really rail against the West. And one of the things he actually picked up on that he railed against was the inclusion of the filioque in the Nicene Creed. If you do not know what the filioque means, that's just a Latin word that means "and the Son." So when we profess the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, which is its full name, excuse me for a minute, I gotta put him down a little bit. Sorry about that. So when we profess the creed today, we have that line towards the back end of it, where we talk about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son. The Son is called the filioque. So originally, coming out of the two great councils, Nicaea I and Constantinople I, the creed did not say that. It said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. So the Son was added in first in Toledo, Spain, as a mechanism to actually help defeat Arianism, strangely enough. Okay, so theologically, both the East and the West kind of agree on this. The East would probably have preferred we said through the Son. But the problem that Photius was identifying, and by the way, it's not that it's not a problem. It was a little bit of a problem, was that the creed was established in a council, yet the Western Church, starting with Toledo and then later with the approval of the Pope, actually modified the creed unilaterally. And by the way, the Pope certainly had the ability to do that. But this became an issue for Photius. And this is where you hear, or why people often say it was the filioque. And by the way, it was not the filioque that caused the split, but people often say that. But that's because Photius made it an issue. He also started talking about, problems with the Western disciplinary practices, the use of unleavened bread versus leavened bread. Do we grow beards or not grow beards? Okay, I mean, Photius was kind of all over the place, attacking Western disciplinary practices and things like the filioque. And that did not go over well with the Pope. So the next Pope, Nicholas, he actually got rid of Photius and excommunicated him. And then Photius simply turned around and said, "Oh, really? I excommunicate you." Um, so, so the next Pope, Hadrian too, he actually did indeed depose Photius, okay, and actually got him out of here, and restored Ignatius. And theoretically, this would end the Photian schisms. So this is like a little mini schism, a mini split that lasted for about a decade, or we thought it lasted about a decade and was now done. Yet, as it turns out, it was not now done, because when Ignatius died, who comes back but Photius? And the next emperor put him in place, very bizarrely. Now the next pope, Pope John VIII, he's complaining, but eventually they come with a compromise. And unfortunately, that compromise document was sent to Photius, who then modified it. So we do now realize that we have copies of it in Latin that are significantly different than the copies in Greek. It turns out that the Greek copies were modified by Photius, who read the modified version, which was very favorable to himself, to all of the Eastern bishops, so that they would, believe the Pope fully supported him. And that was in 1879. So another decade has passed. Eventually, the Byzantine emperor himself turned on Photius when he realized that Photius was just a power monger and would say whatever he needed to say to get more power and influence. So, Basil turned on him, and then the new emperor, Leo, actually deposed him again. So Photius was in, he was out, he was in, he was out, he was in, he was out. So again, this dance went on quite some time, several decades, but eventually the papacy won out. But this whole thing was another one of the blows to East-West relations, okay? And again, today the Orthodox revere Photius, all right? Which may be one of the reasons that you really see Orthodox theologians and apologists really hanging on to a lot of the Photian claims, even though they're really doctrinally non-issues, just because he is so highly valued in the East. Just a thought there. And then we get to Leo the Ninth, a great Reform Pope. Matter of fact, the 2 centuries prior to Leo, you had a really dark period in the papacy. For those of you that joined in on the history of the papacy class, you know that it was a really bad time. And you've seen some of the results of that bad time, what we just talked about with some of the popes that existed really between 800 and the early 11th century. But we get a great Reform Pope. Leo might have been the greatest of the Reform Pope. He's really trying to clean up the church, and putting greater governance and greater accountability for moral and financial propriety. And he wants to improve education and bring back more of the monastic traditions. He wants to do all the good things. He also, though, again, he's at this point the Charlemagne and his offspring, sort of collapsed. So we're back to the Pope being a major power in the West, and so he has to fight. And the Pope actually had an army, and he went out and he's fighting against the Normans, and he was captured. And the Normans, who, by the way, were also Christians at that point, they had been Christianized. They decided to Latinize Sicily, which we all think is part of modern day Italy, but was really more of a Greek island at that point. So he actually knocks out the Greek church, or the Normans knock out the Greek church out of Sicily and Latinize it. The Patriarch of Constantinople, who had authority for the Sicilian church, did not like that. So he retaliated by closing down all the Latin churches in Constantinople. So even though Constantinople was a Greek, center, Greek Orthodox center, it did have Latin churches. And by the way, it's just like today. We have different Catholic churches from different rites here in Orange County. So it's not uncommon to see that even to this day. But what Michael I'm gonna butcher his last name, Cerularius, let's call him Michael C. The Patriarch of Constantinople did by closing down all the Latin churches in Constantinople. Now he's gone a step too far. Okay, so this is an official, leader of the church, doing damage to the Latin Church. The Pope, the head of the Latin Church and the church in its entirety, doesn't take too kindly to that. So he actually sends an envoy. Humbert, okay, Humbert to Constantinople to resolve this issue. But he probably should have picked someone a little bit different. Humbert was a pretty egotistical guy, a little bit impatient, and when the Patriarch of Constantinople literally had him waiting for a couple of months before he would see him, Humbert just decided to take actions to his own hands, walked into Hagia Sophia, again, at that time, the largest Catholic church in the world, and drops the bull of excommunication upon the Church of Constantinople and the patriarch. So little ego, who's got a bigger stick thing going on here. The patriarch, not being shy himself and certainly having his own source of pride, turns around and excommunicates the Pope and the whole Latin Church. So this is what happened in 1054. It's boys playing together poorly. This is when the entire Eastern Church dropped off, at least officially, from communion with the Pope. Now, by the way, in reality, it didn't really change much. The churches worked together and continued to move forward, but officially they were no longer in communion. So it just gave them something more to talk about when they got together. But no one took it all that seriously at the time. We take it very seriously now in hindsight. But at the time, remember, they'd just gone through the Acacian and the Phodian schisms. Most people at the time were of the thinking, well, this won't last long. Okay, this one will be fixed too. But that was probably not the best thinking. Okay, because other things, as you've seen, were changing. And then we only made it worse with the Fourth Crusade, which all the Crusaders, generally the plan was you would march to Constantinople, get resupplied. So again, a good example of the East and the West still working together, and did so for the Crusades to a large extent. They march to Constantinople, they stop for resupplies, but when they see how amazing the city is and how wealthy it is, they say, why don't we just attack Constantinople instead and take all of its wealth? And that's what they did. So that certainly that drove a huge wedge between the East and the West. So what was viewed as the leaders of the Western Church physically attacking and sacking the center of the Eastern Church really doesn't make for good East-West relations. So that was a problem. That was a real profound problem. And then that really cooled the jets for a couple of centuries. Although Eugene IV, the Pope in the mid 15th century, ended up, as a result of a number of things that had to happen here, resolving the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, which led into the Western Schism, where we had multiple popes. Eugene, comes out of that, and we had conciliarism, maybe get rid of the papacy, but he calls the Council of Florence, and in a stroke of genius, actually invites the Eastern Church leaders to this council, which then forced the Western Church leaders to come to it. So he did it perhaps as a ploy to force the Western Church leaders to the table. But in reality, what he ended up doing was bringing the Eastern Church leaders to the table, where they started talking through all these theological issues and realized that most of them really weren't that big of a deal or weren't wholeheartedly believed, and that, we talk a big game, but our differences are actually pretty minor. So coming out of that, the patriarchs of the East and the bishops of the East actually agreed to a reunion. However, by the time they got back home, that news did not go over well. It preceded them. And the lay people were aghast because, again, they had seen the destruction of Constantinople. They had been taught by their leaders that the West is evil, and now you're in bed with the West. So, that reunion was pretty short-lived, and it actually completely petered out when Constantinople now, after holding out for centuries against Islamic rule, fell to the Muslims. And part of the reason it fell was when the Byzantine emperor, called for help to the Christian bishops or Christian princes of the West, none of them responded. So it was sort of the West abandoning the East here and letting Constantinople finally fall to Islam. And look, the guys in the West had their own problems to deal with, clearly. But this just really was probably the final straw. So if you're looking for a final date of the split, I would relate to 1453. The fall of Constantinople was probably that last straw that really solidified the East-West split and made it so that, both for religious and temporal reasons, it was going to be very difficult for any sort, very difficult to salvage any sort of relationship between the East and the West. So where are we today? So today, again, so I was a little bit low on my numbers. It's 1.6 billion with our Orthodox, but you can see that, the Catholic Church is by far the larger of the two lungs. Okay, almost, or more than 4 times, excuse me, as large. And if you're just looking at Christianity by tradition, you can see the Catholic Church is by far the largest Christian group. Protestants and all their various machinations are second. Independent Christian organizations or pseudo-Christians are third. Orthodox is actually fourth on that list. So the Orthodox Church, and think about it, it makes sense that that whole area of the world was totally dominated by Islam in the 7th and 8th century, and so there wasn't a lot of Christianity left. So the fact that there's 297 million Orthodox is in many ways a minor miracle, if anything. So hold on one second. Need to respond. Okay, I am back. So, and then just to see, what Christianity or what form of Christianity dominates in different parts of the world, this map will kind of give you a sense of it. By the way, this is what part of Christianity dominates. It doesn't mean that Christianity is the dominant religion in these parts of the world. So, this is just saying, if you were going to scrape off the Christians from a part of the world, what would they primarily be? So you can see South America, Western Europe, half of Africa, primarily Catholic, Australia, bits and pieces of Southeast Asia, very North Canada, Mexico, Catholic. United States, Protestant, okay, as is Southern Africa, Mid-Africa, and, at least from a Christian perspective, India into China. Although keep in mind that India is not by any stretch of imagination dominated by Christianity. It's dominated by Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. We're just trying to show you that if you had to peel off all of the religions and just had Christians left, which Christian group would dominate in this region. So you kind of see Orthodox is really primarily Western Europe, Russia, and Northeastern Africa is where they would dominate, which kind of makes sense. Constantinople, the Eastern Church, this was their domain, okay? If you look at the Orthodox Church itself, what is it? Well, it's a communion, a very loose communion. In fact, in some cases, a lack of communion now, of self-governing churches. It's called Eastern just because of where it started, and Orthodox relative to to the extent that the churches that consider themselves that way are in communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople. Churches are they either have their own head, they're autocephalous, or they're autonomous, meaning that they're kind of self-governing, but they report up through one of these heads of one of the autocephalous churches. If you were saying who's in charge of this whole thing, well, historically, nominally, it was the Patriarch of Constantinople. So, but not really. He's the first amongst equal, so he doesn't really have any real authority over any other churches other than his own, which is a problem because it basically means there's no one in charge. Okay. They have a great deal of respect for the Patriarch of Constantinople, and that, by the way, has deteriorated over time. But that individual doesn't have a buck stops here authority like the Pope does. Um, Again, there's 15 of those autocephalous churches. You can see the ancient four churches that were once part of the group of five with Rome. And then other churches, the Church of Russia, very important now, very powerful now, but fairly new. Okay. And you can see the years that some of these other churches were created, and they're kind of listed in a rough power order here. With the least powerful being the Orthodox Church in America, which was only founded, less than a century ago. So, and then there's the autonomous churches. Again, they report up to one of the 15 above, or at least used to. For example, in the case of the Church of Ukraine, they reported up through the Church of Russia, but as you can imagine, that's no longer the case because of the tensions and war going on between Russia and Ukraine. So a little bit of an issue there. Some of the biggest challenging theological differences, well, the one that is really far and above in a class by itself is papal authority and supremacy. Okay. The Orthodox will often claim that they believe in a conciliar model where councils dictate and resolve theological issues. That's kind of difficult to really support considering they haven't had an ecumenical council since the split. They're basically kind of frozen in time after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which is not a good thing. And you could actually make the argument that the councils actually started leading to the split. So I'm not buying that. But if we could resolve papal authority and supremacy, I think we'd be in good shape. And that is really the underlying issue. The East finally just rejected any idea of the Pope being anything more than a primacy of honor. So recognizing that, yes, it's the chair of Peter, and we should give it honor where honor is due, but that is it. Again, they're kind of frozen in those first seven councils, so there's been some theological development since then that would have to be caught up on. Purgatory is an issue. Not that the Orthodox don't believe in the idea of purgation and a post-death, the necessity of a post-death cleansing if you have temporal punishment due for forgiven sins or an attachment to sin. It's just a variety of theologies around what that means, and there's quite a few of them in the Orthodox world. So there isn't one consistent one, as opposed to what you see in the Latin Church, which has a very consistent view of what the purgation process is. Immaculate Conception is a problem. Again, Orthodox theoretically say, well, if that was true, Mary could not die, because they're very big believers in the whole idea of sin brought death, although that is not exactly what the Catholic Church teaches. That death was part of human nature, clearly. It is what human nature demands, but God had protected us from sickness and death through a preternatural gift. And there's some disagreement there. But bottom line is what this means for them. Well, if Mary was without sin and immaculately conceived, it means she could not die. And the tradition in the East is a tradition of dormition, that Mary was assumed into heaven following her death. So if she could not die, then their belief in dormition cannot work, in which case they can't support that she was immaculately conceived. So it's sort of ridiculous, circular argument to an extent, but it is what it is. It would also mean that Mary had a different nature, which means that her offspring would also have a different nature, which means he's not fully human. So they'll make the argument that the Immaculate Conception poses two problems theologically. Hence, they're not a big supporter of the idea of the Immaculate Conception. All right. Divorce, also a problem. So you can get divorced up to 3 times in the Orthodox churches. Generally, there's actually some variations on that now, but divorce is something that, while extremely discouraged, is allowed under specific circumstances, and you can do that up to 3 times, which problematic for us. Some of the less challenging ones, well, baptism by immersion only, which is a big belief of them. Although that is changing, they're now recognizing because of the Didache that there's clearly a lot of evidence that baptism by sprinkling, and pouring water over the head was certainly not only allowable but prescribed in the early church. The order of the sacraments, this is where the Orthodox are right. We did indeed change the order of the sacraments. However, what they did is they changed who could confirm. So we recognize that it requires the authority of a bishop for confirmation, as we see in the Acts of the Apostles. They say no, priests can confirm. Now, by the way, priests can confirm in the Western Church and Latin Church as well, if they get approval from the bishop, or what are called faculties from the bishop to do so. So we're not that far off, but what their claim is, we changed the order of the sacraments to accommodate the bishop having to be the one. So instead of baptism, confirmation, first communion, we go baptism, first communion, confirmation. So they are right, we did change the order, but they did also change a fundamental theological belief in who has the authority to confirm. So that's probably an easier one to fix than others. Jesus forgives sins, not a priest. So they have confession. However, their view of confession is the priest is simply a witness. While in our view, the priest is acting in persona Christi and being Christ for us. So yes, we both agree that only God forgives sins. It's just the vehicle through which he uses, or how the priest is used as a vehicle in that forgiveness process is different. There's some ongoing theological ridiculousness about how to classify Adam's sin, original sin, versus ancestral guilt. It's really just a bunch of guys who know too much, speaking too much. The filioque, again, was never really a big theological issue. It was more of a procedural one. I think this one for real thinkers is pretty much a dead one. I think it's a matter of language and talking past each other more than actual doctrinal differences. The Orthodox Church, not big fans of the concept of indulgences, eliminating temporal punishment due for forgiven sins through acts of charity. That's what an indulgence is. They're right. This is not something that goes back to the early church. So this is an evolution in Catholic doctrine over time. It points to things that we see in scripture in the early church and what have you. But the Orthodox have a good point here. This is an innovation. And I think, the Catholic Church and I think the Orthodox can come to a pretty easy agreement on what to do with this one. Adoration, they're not big fans of that. It wasn't established by Jesus. Well, the argument there is there's a bunch of things we both believe that weren't established by Jesus himself, but he did give the church the power to bind and loose, and did give Peter the keys. Hence, the church actually can establish things that have theological basis that can be defended. The canon of Scripture, mostly agree, although there's some extra books in the Orthodox canons, dependent upon which Orthodox church you're talking about. So probably have some work to do there. Now we get into the real little ones, the leavened versus unleavened bread controversy, the beards controversy. Do you have to have a beard? And can't have a beard? Do you need to be clean shaven? And married priests, although that is, again, another controversy that's more of a practice and not really a big deal whatsoever. So, the good news is reunification, a big step was taken towards reunification in the 1960s when the Patriarch of Constantinople and Pope Paul VI got together in Jerusalem and actually finally revoked the mutual excommunications of 1054. So almost 1,000 years later, at least those are no longer in place. So there's no official reason why we need to stay separate any longer. And then, Pope John Paul II, really all the popes since the Second Vatican Council have worked to try to find common ground and eliminate those less challenging issues and address some of the bigger ones. This is from Pope John Paul II's Ut Unum Sint, Lord of Ages has begun to bestow more generously upon divided Christians remorse. So he's pointing out that we're starting to recognize how bad it is we're divided. And there's a movement now. He believes the Holy Spirit is working to restore all Christians, and in that he's actually including Protestants, and that we all want to be one again. So what Pope John Paul II wrote here is he's just recognizing the reality is there's no good reason for us to not want to be together, and there's certainly some effort afoot driven by the Holy Spirit to bring us back together. And again, the Catholic Church, he's making an official statement as the Pope. We want nothing less than full communion. So we hate this. We hate that our second lung is separated. He ends with, how can we restore after 1,000 years? And he's saying, look, both the Catholic and Orthodox Church have to make this a priority. So again, this is the kind of discussions that we're out now in our day and age. Obviously, it's long and slow. You can see that it didn't happen overnight. It's not going to get unraveled overnight. The first step about getting rid of the excommunications was important. Having ongoing theological discussions to really differentiate between the big issues and the little issues and come to agreement where we can is important. It's going to take some time. It's also going to take some people, eating their pride and ego and financial statements, because we have a lot of power and money and physical assets tied up in these churches. And who owns them? Where do they go? This is the reality of the world in which we live. Many of these churches are now de facto state churches. They are intertwined with the government. You certainly see that with the Russian Orthodox Church. And so how do we deal with that? Because that is something that we can't have that kind of dependence and mutual authority in the Catholic Church. So that's problematic. We now have a problem within the Orthodox Church itself, in that it has a great deal of disunity that's grown within its own ranks. So, how can we bring ourselves together when we have multiple partners now in this effort? So it isn't just one Eastern Orthodox Church, it's the Eastern Orthodox churches, and they have different priorities and needs and issues that need to be resolved. So the problem has gotten actually a little bit harder in the last decade or so. We have to deal with the big ones. So it's really papal supremacy, divorce. I'll put purgatory in there, although it's really, it shouldn't be on the same line with papal supremacy and infallibility. Divorce shouldn't either, although divorce is a bigger deal, okay? Because that's the word of Christ we're talking about there. But we have to fix those, and then, we just have to come to some sort of negotiating stance on the minor issues and practices, either learn to live with our differences, because they aren't really doctrinal and have no real impact on our faith, or we have to just pick one or the other. And then the last thing, in order to overcome it, do we have the desire to do it? Christ wants it. Do we? Pope John Paul II pointed out we should want it, but the question is, do we? So these are the stands. And if you're looking for more information, certainly Volume 2, The History of Christendom, Warren Carroll's great book. It's a 6-volume set, but Volume 2 will kind of give you a big chunk of what I covered here in the East-West split, and also teach you a great deal about what happened to the faith during the early Middle Ages and Middle Ages. Michael Lofton's book, Answering Orthodoxy, quick read, really talks about the historical claims of doctrinal differences and how real or unreal they are. Michael Lofton is a former Orthodox who has come back to the Catholic Church. He provides a really concise history of the split. As a matter of fact, you probably could have read that rather than coming to this talk. And I think an objective view of the issues. If you're really looking about something about the biggest issue, which is the papacy, Eric Ibarra's book is the go-to de facto book on this. He actually tries to make an argument from both sides, Orthodox and Catholic, on their view of the papacy. I think the argument falls clearly on the side of the Catholic belief system, but you can be the judge of that. But if you really want to get a comprehensive scholarly work that's well footnoted and referenced, an impeccable piece of writing here, And that's why it's being recognized, even though it's still fairly new, just a couple of years old. The de facto book on the topic, this is the one, Ybarra's book. And then if you're looking for what's happened recently, magisterial documents of value, these four are pretty good. Okay, Paul VI, Unitatis Gratio. I'm going to decree on ecumenism. I should use the English. Decree on the Catholic churches in the Eastern Rite. So you're talking about the Assyrians of the East. Actually, no, you're talking about those Catholic churches from the East who have returned to full communion into the Catholic Church. And then Ut Unum Sint, just the commitment to ecumenism, what that means for us in the Orthodox from Pope St. John Paul II that I quoted earlier. And with that, obviously, if we're live, we do questions, but we're not. So that's all I got. And hopefully that gives you a better understanding of, what the split is, what led to it, and what the reality is of where we are today, which I think is less important than understanding how we got here. If you understand how we got here, we can figure out a path on how to get out of it. But hopefully you have a better understanding of what all this means, why it is what it is, and it's answered a number of your questions. And whether you're Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, hopefully you also understand that there's plenty of blame to go around here. So we all should be careful about pointing the finger, and make sure that we also know how to point it back at ourselves, because we're all responsible, as Pope John Paul II said, for resolving this issue. Anyway, that's all I got. Let's end in prayer. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Lord, thank you. Thank you for all. Thank you for the great gift that is our faith. Help us to work for that unity that you so fervently prayed for on the night of the Last Supper. Let the Spirit work diligently with us. Let us be more open to that work of the Spirit, and help us from both the ground level, Catholic to Orthodox, Orthodox to Catholic, and leadership level, Pope to Patriarch, Patriarch to Pope, really focus on this issue and get these two lungs breathing together again. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.